Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History. As today we look at the 1850s, a decade in which Americans found they could no longer do as they had done for many years, and agree to disagree. Now, the Mexican War was in many ways a great victory for America, but also it was the beginning of a great tragedy. Just as many of the officers who served in the war would later go on to lead armies against each other in the Civil War, so too did the political debates that followed the war lead to that great debate, which could only be solved by other means. The main issue was the issue of Western land, as some Northerners were offended that while Southerners had gotten as much of Mexico as they could hold in the Mexican War, Northern Democrats' slogan of 50-40 or fight had been compromised down to the 49th parallel. Southerners, on the other hand, had been insulted by the proposed Wilmot Proviso, which had attempted to ban slavery in any new territory seized from Mexico, and indeed by some Northerners' attempts to prevent the war entirely. And the main issue at the heart of most Northern opposition to expansion was the issue of slavery. Still, the two major political parties, which still contained Northern and Southern, Eastern and Western members, did not want to divide themselves or the nation along sectional lines, and so they made every effort to ignore the issue. And fortunately, the Senate remained balanced, an equal number of slave-owning and free states, 15 of each, and so neither side could overwhelm the other. In 1848, James K. Polk, exhausted from his term of office, stood by his pledge not to run for re-election, went home, and died. The Democrats then selected as their presidential candidate in 1848 General Lewis Cass, a veteran of the War of 1812 and former governor of Michigan. But he was seen by many as pompous, unpleasant, and worst of all, outspoken on the issue of the expansion of slavery. He believed, as a growing number of Democrats, and some others were, in the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that the people themselves should rule. The inhabitants of any given territory should be allowed to determine for themselves if they wish to be a slave state or a free state. Many people liked this idea because it seemed so democratic, and also it put the responsibility off on the inhabitants of the new territory rather than on their own congressmen. Abolitionists, of course, opposed it because they felt ending the curse of slavery was more important than respecting the will of the people, because if the people could choose, they might choose wrong. The Whigs chose a war hero, old rough and ready, Zachary Taylor, who had conquered northern Mexico. And they avoided discussing slavery at all in public. Taylor, a man with few stated political views, who had never once voted in his life, was assumed to be pro-slavery, being himself a slave-owning Louisiana sugar planter. And he was promoted as a hero of the common man, and much like William Henry Harrison before him. But although he was a Southern slave owner, he was a free soil man at heart, opposing the further expansion of slavery into new territories. In contrast, his vice presidential candidate, Millard Fillmore, a self-made New Yorker, supported the expansion of slavery in order to appease the South. And there were some who were not willing to remain silent on this issue, to oppose the supposedly pro-slavery Democrats and the carefully silent Whigs, anti-slavery Northerners, and here and there Southerners too, formed the Free Soil Party, and nominated Martin Van Buren as their candidate. Their main goal was to keep slavery out of the new territories, both out of opposition to slavery in its own right, and also because they hoped to settle the West, and the small farmers who hoped to move there did not want to compete with slave labor. They supported public works, protective tariffs, and free homesteads for Western settlers, believing in the dignity of the free factory worker and the small farmer, and both of whom were seen as suffering from competition and respect was enslaved labor. Their slogan was free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. And they received a lot of support from conscience Whigs. Whigs opposed to slavery. Indeed, from some Democrats, too, especially in New York, where Martin Van Buren had very long-standing political connections. And while the Free Soil Party obviously would not win, they would go on to help to form another party later on. So Martin Van Buren may have not only created the Democratic Party, but helped to create the Republican Party too. For two-party politics, we can thank Martin Van Buren. And the Free Soil Party may well have made a decision in the election of 1848, as they did take some support away from Zachary Taylor, although they did not keep him from winning. Taylor won over 1.3 million popular votes, 163 electoral votes. Cass, 1.2 million popular votes, 127 electoral votes. Van Buren and the Free Soilers, just under 300,000 popular votes, and nothing in the Electoral College. So the two-party system had held together, each party attracting support from all regions of the country, and the Senate remained balanced. As long as that balance remained, the Union was safe. But another great glory and tragedy of the acquisition of Mexican territory, gold had just been discovered in California, early in 1848. Soon, more and more gold was discovered throughout central and northern California, and in California, a gold rush began. A few men made fortunes in mining. Many more made fortunes selling supplies to the miners, perhaps most famously Levi Strauss, who sold his first blue jeans during the California gold rush. And although we don't know for sure how many people went to California, it was a lot. The population, not counting Indians, in California increased from about 14,000 in 1848 to 224,000, or very nearly, in 1852. Indeed, within a year, by late 1849, the population had hit 100,000, more than enough to form a state, and a group of Californians who wanted order in their settlement, law and order, and a state government, drafted a state constitution and one that excluded slavery, both out of moral opposition to slavery and so that free white miners would not have to compete with slave labor. And with this free state constitution, they applied for admission to the Union. The South was outraged, knowing that if California's state constitution was accepted, the Senate would be unbalanced, and furthermore, the Missouri Compromise breached, as California lay on both sides of the 3630 compromise line. Perhaps they could have made California into two states, with slavery in Los Angeles and not in San Francisco, but that's not what Californians wanted. And the South was deeply troubled as 1850 began. Although in 1850 the South did seem powerful and prosperous. Cotton expansion was expanding, cotton production was expanding, yet remaining profitable. Southerners dominated the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice was from Maryland. Southerners dominated the executive branch, most presidents to this point having been Southern. In 1850, the president was a Southerner, the vice president a pro-Southern Northerner. Southerners tended to dominate the cabinet, and in the Senate, things were balanced, although in the House of Representatives, the North was definitely more powerful, as far more immigrants settled in the North than settled in the South. But while things seemed good on paper, there was a concern that there was not much room on the continent for new slave states. Indeed, both the New Mexico and Utah territories had already indicated a desire to be free states, as again had California, despite the fact that about half that territory lay below the Missouri Compromise line. Furthermore, there was trouble with Texas. The U.S. government claimed that a large portion of the former Republic of Texas was actually properly part of New Mexico. Texans, of course, were furious, threatened to, if necessary, march in and occupy Santa Fe by force. And to Southerners, an additional insult was an attempt by abolitionists to end slavery in the District of Columbia, where many saw it as a pretty bad representation of our republic to foreign diplomats, in addition to being a moral crime. A free district between slave-owning Virginia and slave-owning Maryland would increase the problem of fugitive slaves by giving them a place they could escape to. Again, ending slavery in a slave-owning district was seen as offensive to slave owners. And fugitive slaves were a sore point already. And many fugitive slaves, especially in the Upper South, had been guided and protected on their way north along the Underground Railroad. There were fugitive slave laws dating to 1793, requiring runaways to be returned to their masters, but they often were not, in part because Northern officials often would not enforce the law. To some Southerners, the moral judgments constantly made by the Northerners in their assistance of runaway slaves was even more galling than the loss of property itself. Although by 1850 the number of slaves who escaped to freedom in the North was probably about 1,000 a year or fewer, fewer than the number who became free legally in the South, the principle of the thing was too important to ignore. So, in 1850, there were a lot of big issues. Slavery in the territories, fugitive slaves, and more threatened the nation with catastrophe, even with violence, as far up the line as Congress. But one more time, one last time, the three giants of antebellum politics stepped into the breach. The great compromiser, Henry Clay, who had helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent, designed the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise Tariff of 1833, by now was 73. He suffered from a terrible cough. But with the assistance of the little giant, Stephen Douglas, a Democratic senator from Illinois, proposed that the North and the South compromise one more time, each giving up something, so both could coexist peacefully. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina was 68 and dying of tuberculosis, so ill he could not read his own speech, which was read by the junior senator from South Carolina, Andrew P. Butler. Calhoun also wanted to hold the Union together. The great nullifier was still a Union man in his own way, and he approved of the purpose of Clay's plan, but not its methods. He wanted more safeguards for the South and for slavery, for a preservation of the political balance, although he said if the North was unwilling to settle with the South, the two would have to separate peacefully, or if not, the South might have to choose between submission and resistance. It later turned out that although he didn't bring it up at the time, he had a scheme of sorts to hold the country together by having two presidents, one from the North, one from the South, each with his own veto, which may seem pretty unworkable and probably was, although for a man raised, like an earlier generation of American leaders, on the history of the Roman Republic, he may have had in mind that Rome was ruled by two consuls, who in the days of the Republic took turns ruling the city every other day. Calhoun never got to present that plan, whereby each of the two presidents would have had his own veto, as he died not long after his speech was delivered, not even seeing the end of the debate. His last words were, the South, God knows what will become of her. And finally, the godlike Daniel Webster, 68 and suffering from liver problems, gave his last great address to the Senate. In order to preserve the Union, he pleaded for as many concessions as possible to the South, including a new fugitive slave law. But he said not to worry. As for slavery, it would fail to expand on its own. The great American desert, the Rocky Mountains, were too infertile to support plantations. Compromise was the only answer. In his famous 7th of March speech, Webster convinced the North and won the day, saying, "Let us not be pygmies in a case that calls for men." Although many Northern abolitionists who had viewed him as their friend now saw him as a traitor who who had compromised his own principles to compromise over the Union. Although in truth he was not an abolitionist himself, fearing that true abolitionists would split the Union with their radicalism. And one of those abolitionists was a freshman senator from New York, William Henry Seward, who opposed any concession as a betrayal of Christian principles on the evil issue of slavery. He appealed to a higher law than the Constitution, saying God's law was the higher law, but the Constitution did not follow the law of God. God's law, a higher law, took priority. And so he opposed the Compromise of 1850, and so, to many people's surprise, did President Taylor. Now, Zachary Taylor, although a Southern slave owner, was a free soil man, and as a nationalist, he was furious at Texas's threat to attack Santa Fe. He threatened to march the army into Texas and hang every damn traitor in the state, and he threatened to veto any compromise that was too compromising. But pro-slavery Southerners, especially that outspoken younger generation of fire-eaters, who had come to see slavery not just as a necessary evil, but a positive good, preferable to the wage slavery in northern factories, suggested they might secede from the Union if any concession was made to the North. And Taylor's opposition to the expansion of slavery just made them angrier. And then Taylor died. On the 4th of July, 1850, one of the hottest Independence days on record in Washington, D.C., President Taylor overindulged at a 4th of July party, particularly favoring the iced cherries and cream. This apparently led to a case of acute indigestion, or possibly cholera, as cholera germs may have been frozen in the ice that cooled the cherries. On July 9th, 1850, President Taylor died. Although there are some who've suggested he was poisoned as a way to resolve the crisis over the compromise and see the compromise go through. Indeed, this theory was so convincing at one point that Zachary Taylor's descendants were convinced in the early 1990s to have his grave opened and his hair tested for traces of poison. No traces were discovered, so Taylor was probably killed by his cherries, although some have suggested since he was poisoned by some other poison that tests did not consider. In any case, Vice President Millard Fillmore was now president, and he was a more conciliatory man. Although a New Yorker and no slaveholder, he supported concessions to the South for the sake of the Union. Indeed, men like Fillmore, and particularly the two presidents who would follow him, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, would be referred in the 1850s as dough faces. Northerners, especially Northern Democrats, although occasionally Northern Whigs like Fillmore, Northerners who supported the South politically in order to maintain the peace between the two regions. And shortly after Fillmore became president, with his support, the Compromise of 1850 was ratified. Under this compromise, California entered the Union as a free state. There are now 32 senators from free states and 30 from slave states in the Senate. But in return, both Utah and New Mexico were open to popular sovereignty. Their inhabitants could decide if they would be free or slave states when the time came. Although this may not have been that great a concession to the South, few people in Utah and at most half of New Mexicans wanted slavery. Texas gave up claims to a large area of disputed land, almost a third of the total area claimed, although in return it got a $10 million credit towards debts it owed to the U.S. government. Slavery remained legal in the District of Columbia, but the slave trade was banned. You could bring your slaves with you, but you couldn't buy or sell anymore, as slave auctions on the street corners of the nation's capital struck many people as unseemly. Even many Southerners considered them a bit uncouth. But this was a step, however small, towards banning slavery in a place where it did exist. The main concession to the South was a new, stronger Fugitive Slave Act. This not only jailed suspected runaways and tried them without a jury, it paid judges more to find against the slaves than for him. This law was meant to force local law enforcement officials in the North to help Southern slave catchers. And in some cases, certainly the rumor was in many cases, but certainly in some cases, the Fugitive Slave Act was even used to capture legally free blacks and force them into slavery, claiming they were runaways, which was pretty hard to disprove, especially in the face of an unfriendly judge, as some were. And this was meant to be the main concession to the South, which otherwise did seem to have given up more in the Compromise of 1850. Northerners, though, were offended and disgusted. Many moderates turned against the South and towards abolitionism. Northerners, and even officers of the law, often refused to assist with the capturing of Southern slaves. Some even actively obstructed Southern slave catchers when they could. Support for the Underground Railroad grew. Massachusetts even made it illegal to help the slave catchers or the federal government enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, an act of nullification in the North. And so the Fugitive Slave Act deeply embittered the North and the South against each other. Northerners hated the law, Southerners hated the North for failing to cooperate in good faith. The Compromise of 1850 would not prevent a civil war, although it would delay it for 10 years, long enough for the North to grow stronger and better prepared to win it. In 1850, the Democrats chose a new candidate, Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. He'd been a congressman and a senator from his state, had been president of the 1850 New Hampshire Constitutional Convention when the state created a new constitution. But Franklin Pierce was largely unknown outside New Hampshire. It took 48 ballots at the Democratic National Convention to choose him. He was even more of a dark horse candidate than James K. Polk, and Pierce's opponents said, "Who is Frank Pierce?" He was most famous for falling off his horse during the Mexican War, where he had served as a brigadier general of New Hampshire volunteers. He was considered very handsome and very young, the youngest man to run for the presidency thus far at just 48 years old. All the rumor was he was also something of a drinker, which some held against him. The Democrats adopted as their platform complete adherence to the Compromise of 1850, including the enforcement of the fugitive slave laws. And Pierce, as a pro-Southern Northerner, was described as a doughface. And this did make him broadly acceptable, or at least broadly inoffensive, to all the factions of his party. And to try to drum up support, they called him Handsome Frank, even the young hickory of the granite hills. The Whigs were in a difficult position in 1852. They were proud of their accomplishment in creating the Compromise of 1850 and were notable for the wisdom and statesmanship of their great leaders. But they had only ever won presidential elections with war heroes, and their most prominent statesmen were no longer young. Indeed, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster both died in 1852. And furthermore, they were associated perhaps too much with the Compromise of 1850, which the party leaders were proud of, but many Northerners were not. So the Whigs did turn to a war hero once again. Not old Tippecanoe or old Rough and Ready, but old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott, perhaps the greatest military mind of his generation. And an able diplomat behind the scenes, having negotiated his way out of more than one dispute between the U.S. and Canada. But he didn't come across that way to voters. He could be stiff and pompous. He often said the wrong thing to newspaper reporters, making him seem to the common man distant and arrogant. And furthermore, no one dared discuss the major issue of the time, namely slavery. So once again, this election focused on personalities and mudslinging. Again, Scott was attacked for his pomposity, Pierce for his obscurity and drunkenness. He was described not as the hero of many a well-fought battle, but the hero of many a well-fought battle. Many Whigs, of course, were unhappy with their party's decisions. Anti-slavery Whigs were angry at their party's tacit endorsement of the Fugitive Slave Law by promoting the Compromise of 1850. Anti-slavery Whigs said, "We accept the candidate, but spit on the platform." On the other hand, pro-slavery Whigs worried that although Scott was a Virginian by birth, he now lived when he wasn't off campaigning in New Jersey, and they believed he opposed slavery and would not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. Indeed, 5,000 Whigs in Georgia voted for Daniel Webster, even though he had already died shortly before Election Day. And the Free Soil Party again ran a candidate, John Hale of New Hampshire, who siphoned 156,000 votes away from Winfield Scott. Although that wasn't enough probably to make a difference, Pierce beat Scott 254 electoral votes to 42, 1.6 million to about 1.38 million in the Electoral College. And moreover, they defeated not just Scott, but the entire Whig Party. And the Whig Party, already disorganized and divided, with its most brilliant leaders dead, ceased to function at all and completely vanished by 1854, bringing an end to the second two-party system and leaving a dangerous void in American national politics. Now, I've always kind of felt sorry for Franklin Pierce. He wasn't a great president, really, but he had a tragic personal life, too. He had, I believe, 3 sons, 2 of whom had already died by the time he became president. And following his election, but before his inauguration, January 6, 1853, Pierce's youngest son, his last surviving child, Vane, was crushed to death in a train wreck in front of his parents. Franklin Pierce tried to cover his son's mangled body with his coat before his wife could see it, but was not quick enough. Julia Pierce essentially went insane. She would write letters to her dead son and soon left Pierce alone in Washington, returning to Concord, New Hampshire in her grief. Pierce sank even deeper into alcoholism and loneliness. But despite his personal tragedy, Pierce's administration at first seemed strong and popular. He had a Southern vice president, William Rufus de Vane King of Alabama, although he also died just a few weeks into his term of office, never actually having set foot in the United States during his vice presidency, as he was trying to recover from his poor health in the warmer climate of Cuba. He was sworn in by America's ambassador to Cuba when he was named vice president. So Pierce would go most of his presidency with no vice president. In addition to a Southern vice president, however briefly, he had prominent Southerners in his cabinet, most notably Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, a hero of the Battle of Buena Vista in the Mexican War. Inspired by the ideal of manifest destiny and by the riches of California, Americans began thinking of ways to get west faster and to seize more land for themselves. And if California had become a free state, it was still a desirable one, and people wanted to get there quicker. Rather than sailing all the way around the southern tip of South America, some wanted to go through Central America. Indeed, some ships would sail to the east coast of Central America. People would travel overland and then sail from the west coast to California. But some didn't want to get off the boats at all and proposed building a canal through Central America, either through Lake Nicaragua, where a canal would go from the coast to Lake Nicaragua in the middle of Nicaragua, and then to the Pacific from there. Or perhaps across the Isthmus of Panama, then an unhappy province of Colombia. This was particularly popular among Southerners who hoped that perhaps they could seize territory around the canal or elsewhere in Central America to turn into new slave states. Some Southerners had schemes for seizing control of more of Mexico, or the rich islands in the Caribbean, particularly the valuable colony of Cuba, which it was thought could be made into as many as 4 slave states, or maybe other land in Central America. And one such adventurer was the gray-eyed man of destiny, William Walker of Tennessee, who made several attempts to lead small groups of followers, known as filibusters, in invasions of Central American nations. In 1853, and again 1854, Walker attempted to take over northwestern Mexico, briefly declared himself president, first of the Republic of Sonora, later the Republic of Baja, California. In 1856, he actually conquered Nicaragua, had himself elected president, and legalized slavery in that country. Southerners viewed him as a hero, but Central American nations, with some assistance from Britain, allied together and drove him out of Nicaragua. He later invaded Honduras, but was captured and executed by a Honduran firing squad. And worried about American interests in Nicaragua, the British occupied Greytown on the coast of Nicaragua, encroaching upon the Monroe Doctrine. Fortunately, we were able to work things out. The U.S. and Britain had already signed the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty in 1850, in which we agreed that neither nation would fortify or hold exclusive control over any future canal across the Isthmus of Central America. And now that America controlled a large stretch of the Pacific coast, trade with Asia became even more appealing. Now, Americans had been trading with China for some time, but not with Japan. Japan having closed itself off to foreign trade for over 200 years, wanting to avoid dangerous foreign technology or ideas. They allowed only a small amount of carefully regulated trade to come through the port of Nagasaki, mostly so the shogun, the military ruler of Japan, could keep an eye on the outside world through some limited trade on that isolated island in Nagasaki Harbor. American merchants, though, wanted to trade with Japan, asked the government to do something, and so sent Commodore Matthew Perry, brother of the hero of Lake Erie, to Japan in 1853, showing up in modern warships with modern weapons, ships the Japanese called the Black Ships. Matthew Perry somewhat intimidated the Japanese, said they ought to open to American trade, and said he'd be back again next year to check up on things. In 1854, he returned and convinced the Japanese to open their country to trade with America, and through a combination of threats and diplomacy. Pretty soon, Japan began trading with other countries as well, and the Japanese would learn from their new trading partners, both in terms of technology and in looking around at the rest of the world and seeing it being conquered by Europeans, and began a program of modernization known as the Meiji Restoration, creating a constitutional monarchy and bringing Japan's economy from a feudal agricultural system to a fully industrialized one by the end of the 1800s. Now, having opened one wealthy island, Americans wanted another. Cuba was one of the last remnants of the once mighty Spanish Empire in the Americas. President Polk had offered to purchase Cuba for $100 million, but the Spaniards had said they would rather see Cuba sunk into the ocean than sold to Americans at any price. Unable to buy Cuba, American adventurers, filibusters, many from the best families of the South, made a couple poorly planned private invasions of the island, both of which failed. After the second, many Americans involved were executed. In 1854, the Spanish tried to force a confrontation by seizing an American ship, the Black Warrior, for not declaring the cotton held in her hold to customs officials in Havana, which they were technically supposed to do, but that law was rarely enforced. Again, Spain wanted to prove a point. The owners of the ship paid a $6,000 fine and got their ship back, but many Southerners and some others wanted to use the seizure of the Black Warrior as an excuse for war. And in Europe, America's ministers to France, Britain, and Spain met in Ostend, Belgium, to consider how to respond, and drew up the Ostend Manifesto, in which they said the U.S. ought to offer Spain $120 million for Cuba, but this was an offer Spain couldn't refuse. If Spain wouldn't sell out, the United States would be justified in seizing Cuba from Spain by force. Free soilers, of course, were outraged when they heard of this plan, fearing that Cuba would become one or maybe two or three or four slave states, slavery still being legal and widely practiced in Cuba. And they forced Pierce to drop the plan, although Spain did return the fine collected from the owners of the Black Warrior and actually paid an additional indemnity to make up for the embarrassment. But once again, slavery had prevented America from achieving our manifest destiny. Imagine if we'd had Cuba for 170 years today. And aside from political problems, the United States faced more practical difficulties in dealing with the new western land. Of course, the sea route from the east coast to the west coast was too long, the overland route too slow. Some people even feared that inadequate communication between the east and west would lead the Pacific territories to break away from the Union. Some suggested using camels for transportation, and some were imported from North Africa. All the camels were too contrary to learn English, and they had to hire a couple Syrians to order the camels around in Arabic. But most people felt the only way to manage was with a transcontinental railroad. Once again, there would be sectional competition. Would the route be in the north, or in the south, or somewhere in between? And whom would it benefit the most? Or would we have to build multiple railroads just to keep everybody happy? Southerners, feeling pressured by the North, wanted a southern route. In fact, the very best route from a purely engineering standpoint did turn out to pass through a southern area, indeed an area too far to the south, passing through what was barely northern Mexico. And so to get the best passes through the southern Rocky Mountains, President Pierce appointed James Gadsden of South Carolina as minister to Mexico, where he approached President Santa Anna, president of Mexico, one last time, and offered Santa Anna $10 million for a small strip of land, mostly in what's now southern Arizona, which, after the purchase, was known as the Gadsden Purchase, an act that so infuriated the Mexican people, they forced Santa Anna into exile one final time. Northerners saw this as a waste of money, a whole lot of money for a very small area of desert land. But the Senate confirmed it, in part because this was truly the best route from an engineering standpoint, and because they hoped it would keep the South happy. Another benefit was this proposed line would run through the states of Texas and California and the organized territory of New Mexico, which did have a territorial government to supervise it, whereas the most popular northern route would have run through the unorganized territory in the Great Plains, sometimes referred to as Nebraska. Some Northerners wanted to organize this territory with a territorial or even state governments, so those governments could oversee the construction of a railroad. But Southerners did not want another free territory or another free state or a profitable railroad line in the hands of Northerners. From Illinois, the little giant, Stephen Douglas, who thought of himself as a Northerner to some extent, but more than anything as a Westerner and a Union man above all, tried to work out a compromise of his own. To help promote Western growth and promote the interests of railroads and real estate, in which he had a financial interest, he supported creating a railroad across the Great Plains and proposed a new plan in 1854. The unorganized territory in the plains would be organized as two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. And this would completely throw out the old Missouri Compromise line at 3630. He would open both Kansas and Nebraska to popular sovereignty and let the people decide if their land would be free or permit slavery. Southerners were excited by this Kansas-Nebraska bill. Popular sovereignty did permit the possibility that slavery would now expand into territories north of the old Missouri Compromise line. Indeed, many people sort of assumed Kansas would end up as a slave state and Nebraska as a free state to keep things almost balanced. But Northerners bitterly opposed this Kansas-Nebraska bill, in part because it would abolish the Missouri Compromise that many people saw as almost sacred at this point. And just as Southerners were happy it might allow the spread of slavery, Northerners were unhappy about the same possibility. Many Northerners now regarded Douglas as a traitor. Now, he personally didn't care much about slavery one way or the other. Again, many of his countrymen did. Congressmen came close to shedding blood. Many members of Congress carried pistols or knives for self-defense. But there was enough support for the Kansas-Nebraska bill, including the support of President Pierce, that it was passed as the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854.